Hi there. I'm Alan Gubanich, longtime member of the local Lahontan Audubon Society. In fact, I was their vice president for about 15 years and chair of their education committee for about the same length of time. I'm also a retired faculty member from the University of Nevada here in Reno. I taught in the biology department for about 35 years. What I'm going to do today is try to get you introduced to identifying backyard birds. But before we actually get to the birds, I generally find that people that are looking at this video, whenever I do this talk up at the Galena Creek Visitor Center, most of the people are beginning birders. So I'm going to make the assumption, correctly or incorrectly, that many of you who are watching this are beginning birders. So what I'd like to do before I even get to identifying backyard birds is give you an introduction to how to identify backyard birds. Some helpful hints, I hope, that will get you started to making it a little bit easier to try to identify birds. So let me get me out of here and see if we can just talk about an introduction to identifying backyard birds. Now, the kinds of birds you can attract to your yard, of course, depends on what kind of yard you have. What kind of vegetation, the sources of water, whether you have any water or not, where you live, and so on. And the habitat that surrounds your yard will, of course, determine the kinds of birds you can get. If you're living in the middle of town, that's a very different habitat than if you were living, say, out in the outskirts and are surrounded by a sagebrush habitat. Different kinds of birds living out there would, of course, influence the kind of birds you'll get to see. And if you're somewhere up in the forest, like up along the Mountain Rose Highway, or living up in the Tahoe Basin, you can get an entirely different group of birds there. So the habitat surrounding you and the kind of yard you have will help determine what birds you can see. Now, if you want to attract birds to your yard, keep in mind that birds need at least four things. They need cover or shelter. They need food and water, obviously, and they need nest sites. So let me show you my yard and my house to give you some idea of what I mean by these four things. Here's my house, front of it in Hidden Valley, just a modest one-story home. There's part of the front lawn. If you look to the left of that house and past the garage, you'll see that behind my house, I have a lot of open land, sagebrush and shrub-covered hillsides behind me. Here's my backyard. Now, the wife has been in the house for 35 years, so she's put in a fair amount of vegetation, and a lot of it is already mature, these large mature trees. But the point to keep in mind is if you're going to vegetate your yard for birds, make it multi-layered. Have some tall trees, so maybe medium-sized trees and shrubs, low shrubs, low flowers, blooming flowers, even annuals that bloom only part of the year, because you need a multi-layered vegetation area to attract the most birds. Some birds like to be up high, some near the middle of a tree or down in the top of low bushes. Others like to be on the ground and so on. So a multi-layered vegetation will give you a greater diversity of birds. Here's the front yard. If you were standing in my front door and looking out across the front lawn, you'd see this birch tree there. And then a number of different shrubs and so on along the other side of our driveway. And this is looking basically west. So if you turn to the left and look to the south, you'll see this vegetation along the border of my house and my neighbor's house. So again, multi-layered vegetation so that different kinds of birds can select the kind of habitat they want to be in. And then of course, there's the water and there's some food. So that takes care of at least number two, the food. Obviously, the vegetation itself provides food for the birds, but you can supplement their diet by providing things like this hopper feeder, it's called, filled with seed. And then, of course, if you got one of those, it helps to have a squirrel guard, because you can't believe how many dollars I've spent feeding squirrels instead of just birds. So this does a very effective job of keeping the squirrels from climbing up and getting to the hopper feeder. And then, of course, here in one of my trees, I've got a finch feeder. Some of you feeding finches may be using those yellow socks, which are called finch socks. That's fine too. There are a number of different kinds of finch feeders, all of which work well. So I have a hopper feeder and two finch feeders out front. I also have suet out front, which I don't have photos of. In the backyard, I've got another hopper feeder and another finch feeder, and I also have hummingbird feeders, which I put out in spring and summer and into the fall. I have 2 hummingbird feeders in the backyard and 1 in the front yard. And now I mentioned the water. Well, if you can, get yourself a bird bath for the birds. If you don't want to buy a bird bath, just take a little shallow, say a shallow cover to a garbage bucket or something, and just lay that on the ground and fill it with water. What you want is something shallow so the birds don't have to wade into too deep. This is a fountain that I used to have. It's an old one. It's been replaced by a different fountain, which you'll see in some of the other photos. So at any rate, birds need water, not only for drinking, but they also love to bathe in bird baths with shallow areas of water. You will get more birds in your yard if you have water features than you will if you only have feeders, because not all birds eat seeds. Some of them don't, and they love to use water for bathing, and of course all birds need water for drinking, just like you and I do. And if you want to, you can winterize the water source so it doesn't freeze over in the winter. You can buy an electric heater like this. I got this one at what's called Wild Birds Unlimited at one of the local Moana nursery stores. I'm sure you can probably find these in a number of other locations. So that will keep your water from freezing over in the wintertime. Also, nest sites. Well, obviously your vegetation provides nest sites for birds, but for cavity nesting birds, it's useful to put out some nest boxes like this. You can either buy nest boxes some places or make them yourself. These are all homemade, not by me, but by someone else. I have at least 5 of these nest boxes spread out through the backyard, and I've had house finches and Buick's wrens nesting in at least 3 or 4 of them over the years, including several this past year. And out front, I even have a couple of gourds with holes in them, and I've had house wrens and Buick's wren nesting in those gourds this past year. So nest boxes for nesting sites for cavity nesting birds. And then after the season is over, you clean out all of that nest material so that you don't have a bunch of parasites there that can infest the birds the following year. And then keep them around in the wintertime because they could be used for winter roosting too. On a really cold winter night, some birds might go in there to try to keep warm. So there you go. You need cover, food, water, and nest sites. Now, to show you how useful your yard is for identifying birds, as I said, my wife has been in here for over 35 years. I've been in the house with her for 17 years. And without even trying, in those 17 years, just looking out in the yard from time to time, we've seen at least 75 species and 3 more in those nearby surrounding areas. So that's 78 different species or kinds of birds in 17 years. And here, show you this. On March of 2012, March 29th, again, just looking out the window, we saw 14 different species of birds, including 2 of them that are really not common yard birds. The Lincoln sparrow was one that was migrating through on its way up to higher elevations. And the varied thrush was another migrant coming through that day that go all the way up into the northwest. And then the next day, there were 5 additional species. So in just 2 days, we've seen 19 species in our yard without even really trying to look for different birds. So I always say, your yard is a good place to start learning how to identify birds. Well, if you're going to start trying to identify birds, I encourage you to get a good pair of binoculars. You can spend as much as $2,000 for binoculars if you want, but you don't have to. This Loophole brand is a good one. I like to use 10 by 50s, 10 being the magnifying power. 50 refers to the diameter of what we call the objective in millimeters. Sort of the wider the objective, the broader the view. But you can get a good pair of binoculars in the $400 to $500 range. And I encourage you to do so. Some beginners might like to use a smaller pair of binoculars, 8 by 42, just as good as the 10 by 50s. When it comes to optics, you get what you pay for. Don't buy those cheapo little things like opera glasses or whatever, or the ones that fold up and put in your pocket. You won't be happy with them. Spend a little bit more money and you'll never regret it. So check out some Loophole binoculars that are in the $400 to $500 range. Also, get yourself a good field guide. There are a number of good bird guides out on the market. You can find them in just about any bookstore in town in the nature section. I've been using the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of North America for years, so that's the one that I'm most comfortable with. This is a 5th edition, which is out of date. We're now up to 7th edition on the Geographic Guide. But a lot of people like the Sibley Guide to Birds. Some people like the Peterson. Go out and take a look at a few. Get yourself at least 2 guides, maybe even 3, because not every guide would be the one that you'd like the best. You have to take a couple and get comfortable with them. There is no one overall excellent bird guide. They're all excellent, but some of them have their drawbacks. Others have their strengths. So it's useful to have 2 or 3. And if you're just getting into birds, notice this one here by the Geographic Guide. That covers the birds of all of North America. There's a lot of birds that occur in Eastern and Central North America that don't occur here. And if you have to leaf through the pages here to find Western birds, it can be frustrating. But there are bird books out like this Peterson Field Guide to just Western birds, or the Sibley Field Guide to birds of Western North America. That then eliminates all of the birds that you would potentially be looking at if you were back east. Get yourself one of these local guides first, and then you can branch out later to one that covers all the birds of North America. Also, if you can, get yourself a good checklist. Now, the Nevada Department of Wildlife used to have, I don't know if they still do, but they used to have this checklist. But basically, just about anywhere you go birding, you can go online and you can find checklists for that area. Now, what a checklist does is it will list the birds in different families or groups. So here's the owl family. Here is the hummingbird family. And then they divide the year up into spring, summer, fall, and winter. And then they tell you what your chances are of seeing those birds at that time of the year. For example, the great horned owl, it's common all year round. So you could expect to see great horned owls all year round here in the northwestern Nevada. Western screech owl, uncommon. That means they're here, but they're not as common as great horned owl, and you may not see any. You may have to go looking for them specifically to find them, as opposed to more easily finding great horned owls. You look at the hummingbirds, black-chinned hummingbird is common in spring, summer, and fall, but it's not here in the winter. You check all the other hummingbirds, and again, none of them are here in the wintertime. So you wouldn't expect to see hummingbirds in the wintertime. Also, if you've got a guidebook, get used to looking at the range maps. Learn what different colors mean on the range map. They will help you to figure out what to expect in the way of birds at different times of the year. For example, in this range map, this, I guess it's a chestnut color, shows you the breeding range of this species. So during the breeding season, you can expect to find them there. In the wintertime, they all move down to here or here. Purple means they're all year round. So that means whatever this species is, some of them breed here. In these states, others move farther north to breed. But in the wintertime, they all come back to this area, and some of them even move farther south. The yellow usually means where you can expect to see them during migration, which might take only a couple of weeks throughout the year, but at least you'll be looking for them at that time of the year. Every field guide these days usually has range maps along with the illustrations of the species. So here from the, I think this is the Geographic Guide again, here's a page that shows the bluebirds. The eastern bluebird, as you would expect, is only found back in the eastern states. So you wouldn't expect to see out here in the Midwest or out west. The western bluebird, however, you wouldn't see back east or Midwest, they're only out in the west. And notice that there's an area here, say in the middle of Nevada, where evidently western bluebirds don't occur, but they do breed over here in western Nevada where we are, so we can get to see them here. In the wintertime, some of them winter along the coast, some of them move farther south, and the purple indicates where you can see them all year round. Here's the map for the mountain bluebird, which is the state bird of Nevada, by the way. Here you can see how far north they can go to breed. There, purple shows you where they are all year round, and that happens to include, as a matter of fact, this part of Nevada. And then some of them go even farther south to breed. So get familiar with those range maps that'll help you decide what birds to see at what times of the year. Excuse me. Also, train yourself to learn the different parts of a bird, what we call the topography of a bird. Now, I know this may look daunting at first if you're not familiar with this, But I will be talking about a lot of these different parts of the bird as I go through the slides. And hopefully by the end of the videos, you'll be familiar with most of these terms. But if you don't know what somebody means when they're talking about, did you see that superciliary on that bird? Huh? You're really not going to know what they're talking about. What about a wing bar? Or how about an undertail covert, which is also called a chrysum? Or how about these parts of the wing, right? The outermost feathers of the wing are called the primaries. Those are the ones attached to the hand. The secondaries are the ones attached to the forearm. So get to know these terms, and if you can somehow copy this, this diagram from this video, you could use it and that could help you. Otherwise, just go to your guidebook. Every guidebook will have these topographical illustrations of birds. Some of them are really detailed, as you can see, some not so detailed. But take time to learn these. And in fact, when you get a bird guide, take time to read through the introductory material. I know, most of us who go guide immediately start turning to all the pictures because we want to see what the birds look like and try to identify them. You'll save yourself a lot of heartache if you'll take time to read all the introductory material, because every bird guide has got good suggestions in there as to how to go about trying to identify birds, okay? So, read through the guide. All right, backyard birds. I'm going to do this in 4 parts. First, we'll look at resident birds. Those are birds that are here all year round. You can see them any time of year. And then there are common summer breeders. These are birds that migrate here in the spring, breed in the spring and summer, and then leave in the fall. Some of them might even leave in late summer, don't even wait till fall. Then there are migrants and winter birds. Migrants are birds that pass through here in the spring and fall on their way to somewhere else. In the spring, they're headed farther north for their breeding territories. In the fall, they're going farther south for their wintering grounds. And by winter birds, I mean birds that migrate here in the winter and spend the winter here. And then in the spring, they move out of here and you don't see them again until the following fall and winter. And then I'll conclude with other possible species that could show up in your yard, which could be a mix of residents, common breeders, migrants, or whatever, but we'll worry about that when we get there. I'll start by looking at a common resident bird called the American robin. I think everybody, or hopefully most everybody, can recognize the American robin. Robin redbreast, as we used to call him when I was a kid growing up in Pennsylvania. Now, when you see photos of birds like I'm going to show you, sometimes it's hard to figure out what size they are. I mean, a bird can look really big in a full frame photo, when in fact it's a tiny bird, only 3 or 4 inches in size. So what I've tried to do is include the length or the size of each bird in inches on every one of my slides. And when I say the length, what that means is if they've taken a bird and they've been able to lay it down like a dead bird made into a museum skin with the bill pointing forward, they measure from the tip of the beak to the tip of the tail. That is the length of the bird. And it's useful for you to have sizes of birds as relative goalposts, so to speak, by which to compare other birds. We will use robins as our standard size bird, 10 inches. You know, when I was still teaching at the university, I'd often get people calling me and say, I got this funny looking bird in my yard. It's got some yellow on the head and there's some white in the tail. The first thing I would ask them is, what size is it? Is it as big as a robin? Smaller than a robin? Larger than a robin? Once you get the size distinctions in mind, it helps to eliminate a whole category of other birds. For example, if your bird is bigger than a robin, is it as big as a crow, which is a little bit bigger than 17 inches? Or is it even as big as something like a red-tailed hawk, 22 inches? That would eliminate birds of this size. Or if it's smaller than a robin, is it down in that category of birds that we call sparrows, finches, warblers, and so on? Those are about 5 to 6 inches, maybe 7 inches at the most. Or is it as small as a hummingbird? Some of our smallest birds in the country, 3 to 4 inches. Or is it something like a goldfinch that's between 4 and 5 inches in size? So try to get a number of these birds in your mind as size references. It will help you tremendously. Another way to help you with size references is when the Galena Creek Visitor Center is open, go on up there and take a look at these bird taxidermy mounts. Our Lahontan Audubon Society owns over 200 taxidermy mounts of birds. They're all on display there, free of charge. You can go up there and look at them anytime that the visitor center is open. We take these things out into classrooms to talk to kids about birds. We use them in some of our bird identification classes that we teach at Moana Nursery in the spring, and other various outdoor venues and kids camps and so on. If you don't know where the Galena Visitor Center is, well, take what we old timers called Highway 395, now known as Interstate 580, head south out of town to the Mount Rose exit. Get off on the Mount Rose exit, and about 5.5 miles up the road, you'll see this sign, the Galena Creek Visitor Center, and you'll even see a right turn lane there. Get into that turn lane, turn to the right, you'll go through an S curve, and then you'll come up and you'll see this sign. Now, be careful, this sign is misleading. A lot of people see this and they think, okay, the visitor center is straight ahead. That indicates the trailhead. Visitor center is off to the right, this way. So you have to come up here and turn into that driveway. You'll see a parking lot there. Notice this sign. Turn to the right of that sign, and there you'll see the Galena Creek Visitor Center. When it's open, come on in and peruse all the different birds. They're all labeled so you can identify the birds, or we've identified them for you. You can also go to the Lahontan Audubon Society website, www.nevadaaudubon.org, to get more information about birds and to get information about Audubon Society field trips. We have free field trips for people almost every weekend. We have various classes that we teach and various other kinds of events coming up. So check us out on the nevadaaudubon.org website. And continue looking at all the birds. We have a complete collection of all the owls that occur in northern Nevada. So that's an introduction to backyard birds. Let's see if we can start talking about some common resident birds.